Visual Studio Talk Show.
Visual Studio Talk Show est une présentation du groupe d'usagers Visual Studio de Montréal et de .NET Expertise.
Visual Studio Talk Show.
Bienvenue au Visual Studio Talk Show, le podcast où on discute de construction de logiciels avec la plateforme .NET. Mon nom est Mario Cardinal. Avec moi, le co-animateur de l'émission, Guy Barrette. Bonjour Guy.
Bonjour Mario, ça va bien?
Très bien. Encore une fois, on profite de ma voiture pour enregistrer parce que cette fois-ci, on va aussi présenter un enregistrement qu'on a fait dans le passé. Puis c'est un enregistrement spécial, c'est un peu notre cadeau de Noël à nos auditeurs. Donc, je te laisse, Guy, expliquer le contexte.
Oui, alors, lors de la dernière conférence DevTeach qui a lieu à Montréal au mois de mai 2006, le groupe d'usagers Visual Studio Montréal a organisé un panel, donc une discussion entre des sommités qui étaient présentes à DevTeach. Alors, ce qu'on a dit, c'est qu'on va organiser un débat, un panel où les panélistes vont débattre de c'est quoi en fait les meilleures techniques d'accès aux données. Parce qu'on sait qu'avec .NET, on a l'embarras du choix, on prend dessus ADO, des objets, du mapping, etc., etc. Donc, on a organisé un panel, puis sur le panel, on avait des gens d'un petit peu partout des États-Unis. Donc, par exemple, Rod Paddock, qui est l'éditeur de Code Magazine, lui, juste avant, on avait demandé à chacun des panélistes de jouer le rôle d'un camp, dans le sens de prendre parti pour un camp en particulier, de sorte que, bon, ça pourrait alimenter les débats. On sait que dans la vraie vie, là, c'est jamais comme ça. Là, on utilise toutes sortes de techniques dépendamment des projets qu'on fait. Alors, pour revenir à Rod Paddock, Rod, lui, prenait le parti là, des techniques de code simple avec ADO.NET directement. Donc, on avait aussi Kathleen Dollard qui se spécialise en génération de code. Donc, elle, son créneau, là, c'était, comment générer du code. En fait, utiliser des techniques pour générer du code pour l'accès aux données. On avait Scott Bellware qui est un spécialiste d'orienté objet. Donc, lui, son camp, c'était tout l'aspect là, ORM là, de mapping d'objets vers les bases de données. Barry Gervin, le Regional Director de Toronto, lui, son camp, c'était ce qui va être nouveau dans Link. Donc, dans la prochaine version de Visual Studio, on va avoir des nouvelles techniques d'accès aux données. Donc, Barry, c'était son camp, donc Link. Et on n'a pas oublié le fameux DBA ou la pauvre petite base de données dans tout ça. On avait Richard Campbell, qui est le Regional Director de Vancouver, qui se spécialise en base de données, en accès aux données, qui, lui, prenait la défense du système de base de données. Donc, ça a amené lieu à toutes sortes de débats, d'interrogations. L'animateur du panel était Ted Newhart, qui est encore une sommité dans le monde de .NET. Et Ted a amené toutes sortes de questions intéressantes. Donc, les panélistes ont débattu de tout ça. Ça a donné quelque chose d'intéressant. On doit dire qu'évidemment, la plupart, c'est en fait, ce sont tous des anglophones. Donc, l'émission va se dérouler en anglais. Lorsqu'on l'a enregistré, on n'avait pas prévu nécessairement le diffuser. Donc, il se peut qu'à un certain moment donné, la qualité du son soit pas extraordinaire, mais c'est pas grave. Vous allez avoir il y a plein d'informations vraiment intéressantes là, qui vont être discutées lors du panel. Là. Donc, c'est vraiment une émission intéressante à ce niveau-là.
C'est notre cadeau de Noël à nos auditeurs. On s'excuse malheureusement pour ceux qui comprendraient pas la langue anglaise, la langue de Shakespeare, parce que, comme tu l'as dit, ces gens-là ne s'expriment que dans la langue anglaise. À ce moment-là, on va éviter nos auditeurs qui comprendraient pas l'anglais à nous revenir dans 2 semaines, en 2007, pour les prochaines émissions. Puis pour ceux qui ont la chance de pouvoir maîtriser la langue anglaise, on vous invite à écouter ce panel. C'était vraiment intéressant.
Alors, joyeuse fête tout le monde!
Assistez aux rencontres bimensuelles du groupe d'usagers Visual Studio de Montréal afin de parfaire vos connaissances des technologies.net et aussi afin de faire du réseautage. Pour l'agenda des rencontres, veuillez consulter le www.guvsm.net. .NET Expertise est un réseau de consultants indépendants et experts dans les technologies .NET de Microsoft. N'hésitez pas à contacter un de nos consultants experts en visitant le www.net-expertise.com. Retrouvez les liens exacts sur le site de visualstudiotalkshow.com.
So what I would like to do is I would like each of our 6 panelists, starting with Rod over here to my left, to introduce themselves briefly, give us a little bit of a hint of who you are and what you do on a daily basis, and what your representative data access style is for the evening.
Hi, my name is Rod Paddock. I'm from Seattle, Washington. Our philosophy at our company is we'll code for food. So we write code. We do lots of database applications, Windows, webs, the whole deal.
Does that mean you work for peanuts?
For peanuts?
If you code for food, you will work for peanuts.
He's a Fox guy.
Yeah. Right,
Has
that's
to
right.
come
I'm
with some
sorry.
baseball tickets, though, like Yankee tickets.
Those Mariners suck.
I represent ADO.net, and actually I told a couple of panelists that I am the untyped dataset version of ADO.net.
Boo.
Ooh, yeah, a lot of the drag and drop stuff not going to work in my world. Thank you very much. And store procedures to boot. There's no SQL putting together strings and sending them to my servers. So that's what I am defending. But just wanted to let you know that all of the technologies you're going to hear from here on out, they all go through ADO.net. So I am the gatekeeper.
You're not even going to let Alan speak. You're just going to hold on to the mic.
It's kind of like having a cell phone drop. I'm Alan Griver. I met a bunch of you guys at the keynote. I, until Monday, was the group manager of Visual Studio Data. So I'm kind of, in this debate, I guess, I'm kind of Switzerland because we put together the technologies that all of these people are going to talk about. And hopefully we'll get into a bit of a discussion about why we think there is room for more than one of these. All right?
And if it sucks, we blame you.
Pretty much. But
Excellent.
not if it sucks a year from now.
He just wants our money.
Yeah, exactly.
My name's Kathleen Dollard, and I'm an independent consultant working out of Fort Collins, Colorado, doing training and speaking and authoring, as well as straight-up consulting work. I'm here today to represent business objects created with some sort of code generation. And that's going to primarily be application code generation through the CodeSmith, XSLT, or some other tool. But it's also going to be the strongly typed data set from Microsoft, which is another variant of that, although it's a little bit different, but I'll be kind of covering that waterfront at the same time.
My name is Scott Bellware. I'm a C# MVP based in Austin. I'm one of those Microsoft developers who's really always had Java envy. So
We've tried numerous exorcism ceremonies. None of them have worked.
So I use everything that I can find from the Java world because those guys, I think, really taught me a lot about, really sort of helped me in my recovery from a Fox Pro guy to an actual programmer. No offense, guys. I tend to use the .NET port of the Hibernate framework, and I prefer to use custom business objects for their amenability to lightweight development or quick development, and their amenability to test-driven development, and that's where I'm at.
Hi, I'm Barry Gervin. I'm a consultant in Toronto and a regional director and solutions architect MVP. And I historically, prior to .NET, come from the Power Builder world. So, Power Builder?
VB.
Never heard. It's the non-Microsoft version of Fox Pro.
Except less successful.
I like good design time experience. So any data access strategy for me has to include a component of that. I would consider myself a database guy too, so I really have to know what the heck anything is doing against my database. I care deeply about that. And sort of going hand in hand with design time experience, I'm not a big fan of untyped data sets. I'm a big fan of typed data sets and not of data readers, although they have their place, I suppose. And I'm sort of been really...
Like filling data sets?
I love filling data sets.
Data readers?
No.
Settle down, Scott. We'll get to
to
the fighting soon enough.
Yeah. I like loose coupling between my data access components and my database. I like long walks on the beach, ice cream on Sunday nights. That's it.
Aren't you the link guy?
Well, I do. I'm quite interested in this link thing. I think it has a place, but I don't think it's a silver bullet.
But you're supposed to be the link guy.
Okay, I'm the link guy.
Okay. I'm just point.
Alan's the link guy.
Is he the only link guy?
No, I like link. But,
You're the link guy.
I'm getting myself into trouble now.
Yeah.
Come on, man. Just accept your place in life. You're the link guy.
I interviewed you as the link guy. Are you lying to me?
Okay. Don't make me Jersey you, man.
I'm Richard Campbell. In the morning, I'm a consultant. In the afternoon, I'm the co-host of .NET Rocks. And my role for this, which is a role I play most of the time, is the database guy, making these people not do dumb things to my data.
Which is a difficult task sometimes.
Yes, because somehow it always ends up being my fault you named all the customers John Smith.
Okay.
What if we store our data in the registry for all of it? Is that a problem?
I love that. That makes me happy.
I'm going registry data store.
Yeah, all registry, because then when it says your registry is corrupt, okay? No, there's no not okay button. There's only okay. Reminds me of Access, actually.
Yeah, but at least there you knew your data was corrupt from the very beginning.
But that's interesting. We could talk about putting things in Atom, Active Directory. We could talk about object relational databases.
All the great ways to lose data.
Hey, do you guys want questions, or do you just want to go for a while? Because we'll wait. It's all right.
Hey, he was talking about loose coupling earlier. So.
Yeah, well, Barry likes to couple loosely. So with that, let's turn this around and ask, anybody out here have questions for these jokers, or do you want me to reach into my bag of tricks and pull one out for them? Sir. Oh, and by the way, the rules are that if a question gets asked over here, the next one has to come from at least, one table away. I don't want to be running all the way back and forth across the room. Sir.
Which panelists address object relational?
That would be the bald guy in the middle, as opposed to the bald guy in the blue shirt.
Are we going straight to ORM?
But does it cover? There was a big discussion a year ago, maybe about object space and objects and frameworks.
Yeah, Microsoft guy. Whatever happened to object spaces, and what is it? Does it have anything to do with link?
Yeah, object spaces was a technology being worked on by some people in the ADO.NET team around object relational mapping. Many of the same people are now working on D-Link, and that's actually the approach that we're taking to provide a thin layer between databases and objects. And where it goes from there, as we move into things like WinFS, in things like WinFX that's coming up, that'll provide some more of the object spaces type of capability. So that's where you'll see a lot of that.
So humor me for just a second, Alan.
Sure.
What's the difference between WinFS and object spaces?
Well, WinFS is going to ship.
That remains to be seen, my friend. You said the same thing about object spaces a year ago.
Yeah, okay, how about this? WinFS is in beta. So
you're still not really covering yourself in glory here.
Right. So the basic difference is that there weren't really a lot of major differences, which is one reason why object spaces has kind of faded away. If you start to look at things like link, which provides a simple axis model, and you look at things like WinFS, which allows you to actually model your entities directly into think of it as an enhanced version of SQL Server, you basically end up with a solution for the same goals as object spaces. And instead of going from, no object relational approaches, I guess, brought out by Microsoft to suddenly having multiple ones, we decided to focus all of our efforts on WinFS. And that's really what happened.
So does WinFS represent its own data store, or is it built on top of SQL
WinFS
Server?
is built on top of SQL Server.
Okay. Scott, you're the ORM guy.
I was here to really sort of bitch for not having an ORM solution, so you just kind of took all of my vinegar away.
Well, why do we need an ORM solution, right? Why can't we just write SQL all day?
Write SQL in what?
Write SQL in SQL.
Well,
I don't know. What do you write SQL in?
SQL.
Okay, that was helpful.
Barry?
No, seriously, why do we need an ORM, man?
Well, if you like entity-oriented approaches or object-oriented approaches, then sooner or later, if you're going to save the data and the state in those objects inside a database, you have to go from object to relational, and typically that requires some mapping, whether it's declarative or whether it's imperative is anybody's guess depending on your approach. So whether you're aware of it or not, most people are doing ORM. It depends on how formal you want to get with it. Why we need a framework for it? It's just, I guess, nice to not have to recreate this stuff all the time, especially when it's declarative and is easily generated, whether that be at design time or runtime is, pick your preference based on the performance needs of the app. But I just like working in objects, so that leads me down that route.
Just objects all the way down, right?
No. I mean, not 100%, but for the most of the stuff, yeah. Not all the way down to the database, because my boss won't let me have an object database.
Why not? What's wrong with the object database, Richard?
It's a myth.
Physics.
Depends on what you consider a database. I mean, you could call a file system an object database. The real metrics of a database is its ability to go through those elements of data and aggregate them in different ways, and that's not something object databases are especially good at. They're more blob storage than anything else.
So you're talking about OLAP?
Why, no, Scott. OLAP wasn't even in this. What conversation were you at?
Well, you're talking about aggregating data in different ways. I thought that would be like a reporting thing.
Like some.
You should have just said accessing data relationally.
Yeah. You remember relational databases?
I mean, you do a query, a filter.
My general experience with OR, I can always tell when the guy's using the ORM layer. It's when I see select star from customers, I know you're using an ORM layer.
Kathleen, you want to jump in on this, don't you? Go for it.
Yeah, I do. When we talk about object relational mapping, I think that something that Scott said is really important, and I don't want it to have just gone by as just a passing thing. And that's when he said there's a key here as to whether you choose to do your mapping at design time or at runtime. And so many things we're currently calling ORM tools, and I think Hibernate falls into this, are done at runtime. And we can also do that at design time, which is what we call code generation. And so we do that either way. Now, I would like to ask you all a quick question. Who can tell me where you are doing your mapping today? Because almost everyone in this room is doing mapping today, and I bet you don't know where you're doing it. Anybody want to make a guess? You're doing mapping today between your database and your business objects. Your database and your business objects may differ. If they differ, it's resolved at a single point in time for almost everybody in this room, and many people do not even realize that that is the action that they're taking at that point. So your mapping and your database and your business object looks different. Where are you making that shift?
Yeah, Mario. Where are you making that shift?
Basically, I have a layer that I call a data access, and the role of this layer is to mapping from the relational world to the object.
Right.
So, and if I have a one-to-one relation from a table to an object, that's a simple case of implementing it. And sometimes, if I inherit a database that's been built, let's say, 10 years ago, and I cannot change it, mapping can be very complicated.
Okay, so that's, in most cases, that's a kind of a big wrapper that we put around a stored procedure or SQL statement. Because when we get to our data reader, in most cases, or our data table, if that's what we're bringing data into, we generally have something that parallels our business object. Prior to calling that stored procedure or that SQL statement, we generally have something that looks like our data. And so what we're talking about in mapping is just formalizing that in a way that we actually have our hands around it, perhaps in a data access layer, which you're describing.
Which is why we build data set objects that are untyped, that closely represent our data that's actually stored in the table, because you can store tables and relationships directly in the data set and map to that. You don't necessarily have to have an object layer over it because you have an object layer that's in the data set itself. A lot of people will say, well, I can check things at compile time because I have an object that says customers and it has something called tables. Well, to throw one Scott's way to the TDD, it gives you some compile time checking, but essentially you still need to test your things at runtime, which is what TDD is all about. So you still need to test against your untyped data sets. So basically the way that we've done our mapping is we have a business object that has a data set inside of it that maps directly to the tables that it's involved with in the database. Those can be stored procedures as well, though. So it's not necessarily a table, but usually the stored procedures map to a table, which is how we've done it.
It has been, hang on a second, Scott. It has been suggested in other venues, namely that language which begins with J, that what we need in the world is not more static typing, but more strong testing. Rod, you seem to be advocating that. Is that a true statement?
Very much. A lot of pushback I get when I say we use untyped data sets is that, well, I can't do things that I check when I'm actually writing the code. And it's like, that's fine. I'm going to check it when I actually run my code the first time, or run it through the suite of tools that Scott is talking about with NUnit and JUnit if you're doing Java, or team systems or whatever. The whole test-driven part of the Agile thing is the thing that I think has caught on pretty heavily. So that, to me, it's just ammo for what I've always been saying all along. You need to test your code, period. And the compiler is only going to catch so much.
So I got a question for you. When you call a web service and you get some data back, you just put that in an array list? Or do you put it in a strongly typed object?
Is Sam in the room? Sam Gentili will fall out of his chair if you hear this. Oh, we just returned a data set over the web service line.
Do you make Java guys consume that data set, by the way?
If they know how to parse XML.
Really?
But most don't.
From my point of view, or actually to be honest with you about that, I don't deal with people that are interoping. I got .NET inside my office, and if I have to interop, then I return a more standard set of XML to somebody. But for the most part, we don't worry about it. We're Microsoft Shop inside and out. And then also, if you're talking about the quantity of data over the line, there are a number of HTTP compression tools that you can use to compress and decompress on both sides of the line with very low noticeability, I guess. You don't really notice it.
So Barry, Rod is basically saying that we don't need nearly as much static typing as guys like Anders and the people working on Link would seem to imply. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you have the static. You have the staticness. You're not at runtime interrogating the schema of your application. So whether it's done by the compiler or it's done by some code generator or it's done by your unit tests, I don't think it really matters. I don't think that's a big deal. But I'd prefer to write less code, not more code. So if somebody else is willing to do it for me, then great. And that means having IntelliSense for my columns, because I suck at coding. So
great.
That's great.
That's right.
Oh,
That's right.
wow. Yeah, you know that architect is Latin for cannot code anymore, right?
Yeah. I'd like to get back to the question about object spaces, because I think I take a different perspective than Alan, that I think object D-link or link is actually just an evolution of object spaces. I don't think
de-evolution of object.
No, it does what did object spaces do that D-link link doesn't? I think the thing that
join subclass mapping.
I don't even know what that means.
Scott, what does that mean, Scott?
That means there's some basic mapping patterns so kind of like what Rod was saying. There's a lot of truth in this notion that you got stuff in the database, pull it into memory, operate on it, push it back in the database, data-centric development. When you switch over to objects, you tend to there's this thing that happens where there's a shift in the way you develop and think and code. And you don't actually end up with shapes in memory that look like the shapes in the database, just because the OO thing doesn't look like the relational thing. And that's why we got Zen and C omega and ultimately Link, that there's this disparity between the shapes that you get, both conceptually and code-wise, right? So joined subclassing is joined subclasses is a way where you have, let's say, a person related to a person-based class and an employee subclass, but in the database, that's represented as a user table and an employee table.
But I can do that with D-link and link.
No, you can't.
Sure.
You need two objects.
You should have seen Alan's keynote.
You can do joint subclassing in now?
Well, no, you can define the class of your customer, and you can map it to whatever query you want, and you can change the ancestor of the classes that
So
mapped.
you can do it. I mean, you can go ahead and map your D-link to, if nothing else, to stored procs, right? You can map it to different tables. And the stored proc could do the joins across it. You may have to do some extra
Right, okay, yeah.
writing.
So you can, okay, so any data access framework can do that. But it means mapping. So if we take out views out of the issue to munge things into things that we don't have, then we push it back. We push the responsibility back into the database to represent things that the object roles means, which means that we're leaking the abstraction downwards.
That's actually one of my issues with object relational mapping.
We're all laughing at you, Scott.
Which goes
on the
back to
inside.
what you were saying is, if I go ahead and I define an object hierarchy at design time, and now I have a need to get information that's not part of my hierarchy. You know, one of the things that I mentioned in my keynote that I liked about D-Link and link on top of it in truth is the fact that I could break out of that object model when I wanted to.
Oh,
but
the
it sounds
projection,
to
so
me
it's fantastic, absolutely.
Right, but it sounds to me like, you know, you're not okay. You're not okay with using all of the capabilities of the database. You know, saying if you take views out of it. Well, views are a core capability of how we store our data.
Yeah, views
but you are
good,
okay
Scott.
with
views,
breaking out of the object.
No. I'm saying that there's a leaky abstraction going downwards. And basically, to clarify what I mean is, when we create structures in the database that are specifically there to serve our object model, then the abstraction is leaking, period, and it's leaking downwards, which I think is a pretty bad way to leak.
Richard, do you often see, I mean, you know, as the database guy, you're often on the receiving end of some of these, you know, persistence, you know, techniques and so forth. Do you see people doing ORM stuff, running into, you know, the abstractions leaking and creating performance and scalability problems at the database level, or is this just, you know, mental worrying?
See, I always hate agreeing with Scott, so I'm fundamentally impaired right now.
So you just want to let silence be your answer?
But you know, the reality is that when you're in the business of writing stored procedures for the developers, that sort of DB developer role, what you're usually doing is building stored procedures to map the object layer. So, you know, you never actually said the answer to your question, Kathleen, which is yeah, but that was the point. It happens at the stored procedure. That's where we are doing those conversions. And hey, let's face it, T-SQL isn't real good at it.
But yeah, I don't have a problem with that though, and I think Scott does, and I think that's.
Well, I just think it just basically it hampers the way, as not a Mort, an Einstein, or an Elvis, that I do software development, which means that I don't like getting DBAs under my feet when I'm building an object model and doing integration testing against the database until it's time to optimize.
So Scott.
So I don't want that, and no slag to DBAs, but I need the agility to change my model as I'm building my app and understanding it. So, and I don't need that thing of, okay, well, I'll go back to the DBA and I'll get a new stored
The thing is,
process.
we need the agility too, right? We use that stored procedure as an abstraction layer so that we can alter the database to deal with the realities of what you've done with the data.
Well, sure, but but there's this other practice that like Scott Ambler's talking about agile databases, where if you take into account agility practices, you can sort of throw away the fear of refactoring a database the same way we have no fear of refactoring an object model.
Absolutely, but the cusp of a refactoring is an interface.
I'd like to divide the audience for this type of problem into two, because there's two scenarios. There's one where we have a database that's there to support a single application, and then there's a database which is a shared enterprise service that many applications call. And if there's a complexity in my database, and the storage is there because it's ultra third normal form or something that just doesn't work well for applications, then I probably want to encapsulate the rules for flattening that out into something that's more manageable with a stored proc. And I want to share that stored proc between all my applications, my .NET applications, my Java applications, my Power Builder, and my FoxPro applications. If I do that in my data access layer, then that's isolated for that application, and that mapping, that subclassing is not reusable, which I guess is okay if that database is only used for that application.
Or if all other applications talk to it through some other abstraction.
But that never happens. That's not realistic.
I beg to differ.
Well, I mean,
so much for web services.
So Crystal Report goes through that.
It's had a couple.
But Crystal Reports is talking to your online transaction processing database. I think there's a sort of architectural.
How many people in the room have a report that hits their OLTP database? Come on,
you all do.
Everybody does.
If you know what that means, even if you don't.
How many people didn't quite understand Barry's question?
How many people have reports in their applications? Okay, there you go.
How many people know what OLTP means? How many people are just here because of the free food?
What free food?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, you're going to be sadly disappointed then. Okay, let me put this on pause for just a second. We had a comment that wants to go back about 3 stack frames here on the conversation thread. Go for it.
Yeah, sorry to beat this conversation to death. Rod brought a point a couple of minutes ago about regardless whether you're using strongly typed data or untyped data to do runtime testing, and that is certainly true. So many times people take clean compiles as a form of testing, and that's certainly not the case. But with working with strongly typed data, you get IntelliSense and you get statement completion, which is something that we hear so many people, and if anything, even more from the BB camp, stating that you're gaining a level of productivity there. So I think it's important to mention that even though you have to do additional testing regardless, you still get IntelliSense and you still get the productivity and the efficiency of that when you're working with strongly typed data that you don't get with untyped data. I think it's important to remember that.
Would you think that maybe building an object model, like a straight POCO model, would support that?
Whoa, POCO? That's one I haven't heard.
Plain old CLR.
Plain old CLR object?
This,
by the way, is a derivation of a term in the Java space that we call POJO.
I told you, I got Java envy. It's
plain
big,
old
it's
Java
bad.
objects. See, I've heard them called potnos or ponos, but never POCOs.
POCOs, baby.
Wasn't POCO a group in the 70s?
I was born in the 70s, dude. I don't remember.
Say you had a object model that you built in code. That would probably give you the same sort of IntelliSense capabilities, right?
Right. Yes, it would. And I'm talking about type versus untyped data sets. Obviously, with that, you get...
So I just kind of want to step out and say there's another approach to productivity that has nothing to do with IntelliSense. So I'm the guy that builds strongly typed objects. I turn off IntelliSense. And I only get IntelliSense when I hit Control Space because it gets under my feet when I'm doing test-first programming. So I don't really think... I appreciate what you're saying because you're saying strongly typed, and I like that, and I'm trying to recover from strongly typed. But I don't really sort of agree that, I think that what Rod's doing is probably very productive because IntelliSense is just productive in one sort of stovepipe of the way you do things.
I think productivity, stovepiping is pretty good. You're going to trade off productivity in different areas. So I'm going to trade off productivity that I auto-generate my back-end, my business objects. I have one object I talk to. I don't have to recompile any front-end or middle-tier object when I make a change to my schema. If I have middle-tier objects that need to consume it, yes, they'll need to be recompiled or adjusted, which is kind of what Barry is talking about, where I have one kind of set of services. I just like not having to rebuild things just for the sake of the fact I added a field. So it gets easier if your data model is static or fairly static. You have an environment where it doesn't, if you're in new development, you're constantly adding new tables and fields and things like that. And I can build adaptable objects that when I change my schema, they just get it on the front end. So I'm trading some things off. And yes, it can all be push of a button like Kathleen. She's going, I can just push a button and generate it. Yes, and I have some generators for these types of things. So I'm not going to disagree with that.
Let me ask this question. Barry alluded a little while ago to the difference between sort of a stovepipe app, where the database is there, slaved to a particular application, if you will. It's a one-to-one mapping. And more of an enterprise scenario where you have lots of applications hitting a single data store and so forth. Do you guys believe that we still need a fully relational database? That Barry was sort of alluding to the idea that we don't need third normal form and we can build things that are more object-centric, which then yields the question, do we still need Richard?
It's stored in the registry. Put it all in the registry, right?
I can answer that in one word, and that word is performance. You are never going to get performance out of object databases like you would ever get out of a transactional database, period. Otherwise, it would have been done.
Yeah, I would also, every time somebody swears to me that this app is truly stovepiped, nothing else ever needs to touch that data, something else always touches the data.
Only because you've
it's a
given
reporting
them
tool.
the connection
it's
string.
Something comes along, and it's my fault.
Well, if you're giving out the connection strings, sure, yeah. Don't give away your connection strings.
You know, Richard's really bitter about this. Richard, do you want to take a time out? I mean, it's okay, man. We can, you know.
If I could get a cold beer, I'd be happy.
Can we get a cold beer for Richard, please?
I have never met a DBA who has not typically said, and it's all my fault.
Because it always is, right?
Exactly
The nature of a DBA's role is either you did the job perfectly and nobody can tell, or you messed it up and it's all your fault. You get an F or a C. There's no A's.
Are you one of those DBAs that say all our columns have to be not null?
No, because sometimes columns are null.
Okay. Kathleen, did you want to jump on that point, or Kathleen's not paying attention to me? All right. You missed your chance, Kathleen. What's up?
What's about, you have a structure for a database, and we have, a way to structure to not, for space and database. And Scott said, the business, entity was very different looked at database. So why you try not to give more way to get out the data from database to mix easier, the object? Because you have the discussion is the data table with relation. You try to get that and said, okay, because we have in this format, we use that one to make a business object with data set or something like that. But the real world is data is stored like that because it's fast, it's more bigger, but the applications must be work like clients think and client. So why you don't just try to find a between, just not just all get out of database only the tables and relation. Maybe you can just already give objects better. I don't know.
I was going to say, I'm glad that you had both hands free because, I don't know which one you would have used to hold the mic.
Well, let me ask this. Why should we store objects in databases to begin with? So I worked for a company called Pluck, and we have it's an RSS company. You probably see the, plus Pluck thing everywhere, right? We had massive, in-memory stores on a grid of 64-bit computers, and we did not save stuff except to back up RAM. And we basically jumped all over Link because oh, great. Yeah, we're using anonymous delegates to do finds, but here's a great way to actually explore this even deeper. So, why? Why database? I mean, obviously databases are legacy, we need them, but I mean, there is also a possibility going in the future with 64-bit memory and grid computing that having to deal with databases
I think you misunderstood his question. If I speak broken French, so...
Apparently broken English, too.
I think what you're just saying, though, is that we should really design our databases the way the data exists, or it should be, or the way it, physically exists in, an end user's head. And I think that's a very altruistic goal, but sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes you don't have control of the schema of the database. Sometimes the schema has to be changed because it needs to support
DBAs.
Maybe more abstraction than your application needs. Maybe another application, maybe you're working with products that are, books, so they have dimensions and number of pages, and somebody else has to work with, chickens or crates of paper.
It's the one salesman problem. There's only ever going to be one salesman on that order, ever. Well, except over here, right? And all of a sudden now it's my fault that you put two salesmen on there, and when we went searching for the order for the second salesman, we didn't find it, right? The reason that we keep beating normalization on this is because you keep punishing us when we don't.
Normalization exists for a couple of reasons, one of which is invalid. The rest remain valid. The one that is invalid is that when the whole normalization idea in early databases came up, storage was expensive. And that was the one thing that has changed. Everything else, like the fact that if I have an address that applies to 3 or 4 accounts at the same customer, I need to be able to change that address in one and only one place. And so all the other reasons that we ever did normalization remain. And so I really believe that the first couple of normal forms are still totally as valid as they were at the beginning, only for less reasons, because one reason has completely gone away. I think. I mean, obviously, if you have big enough, you're storing something big enough, storage is still going to matter. But in a practical basis, we don't care anymore.
I disagree with the storage is cheap. Yes, the hard drives are cheap. The quantity of data that we store is infinitely bigger. We wouldn't store the amount of data that we store now, but we do it because we can. So yes, the hard drive that I can stick in my laptop is a lot cheaper now, but I'm storing a lot more on there than I did in the past. So I still think it's valid. And when you get up into the enterprise space, the storage is not cheap. Once you go beyond the in-computer disk drives, forget it. It's $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for the smallest arrays you can get of SAN storage.
But you're telling me that on the 100 byte or 200 byte level, it's expensive?
No, but when I store 1 billion of those, yeah.
You don't really model your database to save space.
No, I don't worry about it. But I'm just saying that this space is still cheap. No, I do my data schemas in such a way that I can get my data back rapidly. And it costs a lot of money when you got a 1 billion row table and you have to spread that across 45 drives to do it.
Is the cost really in the disk drive, Rod, or is it in some of the supporting infrastructure around it?
It's all of it, because 17,000 RPM, you just look at HP or any of the storage vendors, they're only selling you anywhere from 30 to 80 gig hard drives that spin at 17,000 RPMs. It's not cheap when you get up into that level. I have a room full of hard drives at one of my clients, and our budget is in the millions of dollars a year to add storage to it. It's easy to say we started with 70 gigs of data 7 years ago, and we're up over 1.5 terabytes of data now. So that's how much it's grown in 7 years, and it's been an expensive battle keeping up with that amount of storage.
But sometimes we actually have to duplicate data to make it faster.
Hence the whole OLAP
we're
concept.
Normal, Rod. How many people in this room store 1 terabyte of data they have to access quickly?
Have you seen my music collection?
Raise your hands high. There are some of you. Okay, that's real for some people. But for 99% of the people in this room, okay, 85 or whatever, this is not a question.
However, he's talking about something over time. I mean, the one place I agree, I think it's incredibly inexpensive on a per byte basis. But how many of you, 10 years ago, right, would have ever thought that you'd come close to filling up a 40 gig drive on your laptop? And how many of you regularly are battling to free up space on your laptop? Right?
Well, until Microsoft really embraced that bloat stuff, I hadn't really thought about it, but now.
Well, I will bet that, within a few
not
years,
data.
It's bundling.
Everything is data.
It's
That's
porn.
the beauty
It's porn
of
if
data.
you're filling your hard drive up.
Everything is data.
Okay, it's not my data.
It's all the data that Microsoft is gathering about you that they're going to send off to the big black computer that tracks you from birth till
Don't
death.
forget the helicopters.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. Google bought those rights. Okay,
Google bought the helicopters.
Yes, now they're black with Google on the side. Another question from another corner of the room.
Okay, this is more directed to Rod. One thing that you had said was untyped data sets. How are you dealing with the UI? Because one of the things, the great new features in 2005 is being able to attach to objects and being able to bind very easily. How are you handling that now? Because that's a big development. RAD piece that they've added in.
That's a good question. Actually, the way we get around some of it is we've built our own framework on the front end where we've given ourselves placeholders that this field on this screen binds to this table and this column name. We don't get drag and drop or drop down list types of things. I'm not going to disagree with that, but I know the name of the table I'm binding to and the column name I'm going to bind to, so we just do that. That's what we end up doing.
Okay. Scott.
And test for typos.
Oh.
Well, yeah, test our code.
I did want to point out one thing. One place of agreement that I think we'll find, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that
You're wrong.
The key here is that, right, thanks. The key here is that everyone has picked an approach that they like and has adopted their processes and their tools, etc., to take as much advantage of that as possible to be able to rapidly deploy the kinds of applications they need. And that, I think, is really, the hallmark of professional development.
Did we try to do a good job?
That you not only focus on doing, shipping a particular application, but you're also looking at the things involved in shipping it and driving that time to be as short as possible.
So you're saying we're also lazy?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I understand.
I mean, when I was a developer, I used to say, I am the hardest working lazy person I know, because I would work for hours so that I'd never have to do something again.
Ellen, you are definitely the laziest person that I know.
Hardest working lazy.
He gave up hardest working
lazy.
when he joined Microsoft.
Okay, the other question here is to Scott, and now you're taking a different approach.
Just bring it on over.
And
Sorry, Kathy, go ahead.
It's not beer, Scott. It's just water, man. You could be a little less
No, he's got beer.
enthusiastic.
It's beer.
He's got beer.
Oh, is it beer?
And it's in
Really?
ice.
Oh, hell, I want to be on the panel now.
I'm sorry, Kathy. You've been preempted.
Okay, and in your approach, one of the issues that comes up is the fact that, say you want to, if you take a more data-centric approach with your application, you might be running stored procedures, and you want to pull from about 4 different tables, and it makes sense to be able to pull it back and to put it inside of a grid and be able to interact with that. When you deal with more of an object approach and not a data set approach, more like what Rod has brought forward here, you run into issues with trying to deal with, you might only want 3 columns out of a particular table that could be 25 wide, and all of a sudden you're having to pull back much more data just to fulfill the need of the objects.
Yeah. Well, let's look what was his name? Richard was saying. So, you know, there's a man once made an interesting analogy about ORM and America's problems with Vietnam. And any reasonable...
Wait. If you're going to say it, we got to say it correctly. ORM is the Vietnam of computer science.
Right.
Who said that?
Some incredibly brilliant philosopher.
An analogy
somewhere.
that has been taken so out of context to be used to trump up so many of our own philosophies and back our own ideas. But my understanding of that, Ted, is that people like me who get into ORM tend to try to do what Kathy's saying and try to drive ORM into every possible usage scenario. And in the thing that you're talking about where you need a projection, I mean, thank God for D-Link and Link, because it really solves a projection problem with static languages, or anonymous classes at least do. But no, I would never do that. I'd use a stored proc and a grid and a data set at that point. I mean, there's a difference between being a complete zealot and a complete idiot, and certainly I am both often and most of the day, but sometimes I'm discerning.
It's true.
So, guys, one of the things that you know sort of has been we've danced around significantly, you know, with all of these different topics, is this notion that on the one hand we have these object programming languages, and on the other hand, you know, the general storage mechanism of choice appears to be a relational database, and we have this real mismatch between the two. Why can't we settle on one versus the other? Why do we need to have object languages and relational storage? What stops us from having relational languages, if such a thing exists, or what stops us from having object storage? Why do we need both? Why do we need, you know, these two completely differing, non-meshing approaches?
You're just trying to figure out if we know the answer, right? You're sitting on the answer. Vietnam boy over there sitting on the answer, and
I'm just moderating the panel, man.
Yeah, okay.
You know, you want to come out here? You want to trade jobs?
Not a bit.
Okay.
I get beer. So.
Yes. Now you see what happens when you pick last.
There you go.
Well, we're solving 2 different problems is the short answer to what you're saying. Now, we can go into that to as much depth as we want to, but that is the short answer. We're solving 2 different problems. So in one case, we're looking at a static storage of data, and ultimately that's what a database is. Even the in-memory stuff is ultimately a relatively static situation. Static in this case can mean 5 seconds, but it's still static in that sense. That's what we're doing on the database side. And on the object side, what we're doing is we have an active entity that has an active purpose, which is either to display to the user or to do something else. And it has a transient lifetime, and it has a job to do. And so for those reasons, we're solving 2 fundamentally different problems, and we're using the right tool for each one. For the same reason, you don't use a hammer and a screwdriver for the same thing.
Are objects always the right tool, though?
I was going to say, maybe we should get rid of object-oriented languages, because I don't think they've done nearly as much for business applications as relational.
Well, certainly not for VB developers.
Well,
Yeah. Well, look.
How many people on the panel, by the way, code routinely in Visual Basic?
What do you mean by routinely?
Well, you would classify yourself as a Visual Basic developer first or a C# developer first.
I'm a
VB.
Fox Pro guy, and then...
And C#. And Richard is a T-SQL guy.
Yeah, I don't program anything routinely anymore.
He's a radio personality, for God's sake.
Any given day is a different language. I hate to tell you the last thing I programmed in before I left for this trip.
Oh, please do.
PHP.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice.
He's in that CIO world. You know, career is over.
Yeah, when you can't even architect anymore, then they put you on the board.
Right.
Peter Principle.
Ted, there's some part of the question that you asked that I think is kind of significant as we roll into D-Link, and as many people catch on to tools like this, where you have this why relational versus object, and there's this notion when you're dealing with objects that you have a graph of things that are always available in memory, and you can just navigate from relationship to relationship to relationship, and things are always there, and that's a big problem for data retrieval, because you wouldn't want, you want to be able to specify, I want to retrieve this table, I want to retrieve order to line item, and that's it. And with objects, you can go order to line item to product. And you've got an n+1 problem, which is, do I retrieve my entire domain model every time I ask for an object, right? So unless you're dealing, and the solution in the object world is lazy loading, which is really not much of a solution.
Yeah. Give me everything, just take your time.
No, I think lazy loading. I think that's cutting it short. Give it to me when the user asks for it.
No, you're right. But you need an active connection, and you've got to manage temporal issues
I'm
there.
in a short pipe world, guys. Those of you that are in a long pipe world, that's a little bit different than what I generally do.
Scott, she wasn't talking about that.
Oh, sorry.
Shea
I was
Perry
seeing
is
a different
after
color.
the panel.
At least cover the microphone next time.
Well, Scott,
We actually had Kathleen be quiet there for a moment.
Scott, at least you didn't have another speaker at this conference comparing sizes between two of the different speakers, such as happened at dinner last night. But we won't say any names. Anyway, we had one more question, but Rock's going to try it in French, and maybe Eric, if you want to try to translate for us.
Dans l'avenue de Scott, dans lequel on utilise des objets pour sauvegarder dans la base de données, est-ce que c'est pas possible, me semble, on pourrait imaginer une façon de parler au provider en objet et que lui traduise en relation en arrière avec les parents enfants, puis qu'il s'occupe des clés, qu'il s'occupe de tout ce qu'il a besoin pour vraiment garder ça en relation, mais que nous, les développeurs, on parle au provider en tant qu'objet.
Oui, non, c'est possible, mais ça prend une base de données qui est faite en objet.
Non, ce que je veux dire, c'est que tu gardes la relation.
Thanks, Eric.
Non, mais sans aller avec une base de données complètement objet, juste, tu sais, il y a moyen de faire que le provider, tu lui parles, nous on parle en objet, puis que lui il dit, j'ai une collection de tel type à l'intérieur de moi, je vais créer une clé parent, je vais créer une table parent-enfant ou une table croisée s'il faut pour faire le lien, tu sais. Ça, c'est poutine de SQL Server pour
absolument. So Rock's question is, isn't it possible if you're using objects just to have some sort of provider implementation that responds and understands what you mean when you're talking objects? And yes, it is. And that's really what ORM frameworks are trying to do. They tend to get lost in the weeds every now and then, and their users get lost in the weeds often enough as well. And that's ultimately what D-Link is really trying to solve, is having a provider model that if you're using objects, you can talk objects, and then there's a transformation layer to the command patterns that live against relational databases.
But also, just as importantly, an exception case, that there's a way to get out of that object layer when you need to, because you do sometimes.
I hope so, yeah. You'd hope so.
Okay,
objects aren't the natural way to represent relational data. It's totally a natural thing that we're doing with bridging objects and relational data. So it's not going to be easy. And making just a plain old provider, it's just, you can do it, and Hibernate and Hibernate are good, and these frameworks, and D-Link is quite good, but sooner or later, it's like, pay attention to, I guess, what Ted said about the Vietnam thing. No matter how good the provider is, there are design issues when you're bridging these different paradigms that actually can get pretty screwy.
Actually, I want to add to that, or add to that. Basically, the thing about D-Link, it's not a silver bullet and isn't going to solve all the problems. In any one of our different methodologies of doing our data access, there are trade-offs, every single one of them. So if you're using D-Link as this lingua franca translator over all of your data sources, there's overhead there to do that translation from A to B and B to A. So that's basically, it's not the silver bullet. It doesn't solve all problems. It does solve some unique problems and some interesting ones that are, dumping data and merging objects and things from Oracle or PHP or XML or whatever. It can do that. But there's that overhead where it does that translation from one language or one metaphor to another. So,
well, in the end, there's no shortcuts, right? I sit back in my back room with SQL Profiler, watching the terrible queries your code wrote, right? That's what happens, right? Somewhere along the line, it doesn't matter whether
Richard, get a life.
I had to do something. But you watch.
Baby, you want to go out? No, I'm watching SQL Profiler.
I just.
Hey, do you want to watch Profiler? No, I'm going to watch SQL Profiler. Thanks.
I just picture him in this dank dungeon somewhere.
Well, it gets better.
Muttering to himself.
Watching the matrix of T-SQL go by at the protocol level.
Well, it gets even better because Richard's office really is dank now. You want to tell them about your experiment with water with a fish tank there, Richard?
Well, yeah. I tried to do external water cooling, didn't I?
He doesn't even look at the SQL. He looks at the execution plans.
Yeah. Look at the individual. I work out of my house most of the time, and I have a fairly large office, and I do monitor a lot of servers at once on my various setups. And I had a saltwater fish tank split about 2 weeks ago in the office, which was bad. So,
how many gallons was it?
120 gallons.
120 gallons of water.
So you had 120 gallons of water in your server room.
Salt water.
Okay.
In the office.
Is this the first time you had a lot of water pour out in your office?
Yeah.
Come on, really?
No, really. I bet.
Yeah.
I had a crew in there. Fortunately, we designed the office with the fish tank in it, so everything was off the ground. That's the whole trick. 17 computers, no visible wires. Right? So the mess wasn't that bad, but the office is completely dismantled. So we're down to bare concrete, walls are cut out, the desk's all gone. And then I came here.
So do you ever blow dry your hair in the bath? You mix those things?
All the computers are water cooled. You know that, right?
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
All right.
Not with salt water.
Rock did have a follow-up question, if we can get past the salt water thing for just a second. Rock did have a follow-up question, which he asked me while you guys were talking nonsense. And the question was, and I may be paraphrasing here a little bit, but when we get into some of these business objects scenario, we now get into this rather unfortunate position where we're maintaining state in sort of two different places. You have state stored in your database, and you have state stored in your objects. How do you know what kind of infrastructure do you build in your code? And maybe this is aimed at you, Scott or Barry. How do you know when exactly you want that state, that object state, pushed to the database? When do you not want it? How do you deal with caching comes up, update propagation? How do you deal with the notion of object identity? How do you wrestle with all of these things?
We're consultants. It depends.
This is the part where you start handing out business cards, Kathleen?
It's a hard question. And
Ted, we can help you with that. We just need to talk about a contract first.
That's a good question. How many of you want us to gloss over that with a trite answer? Everybody?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. It's a really good question because the reason it's a good question and the reason that I was joking about consulting is that it probably differs down at least 3 or 4 different major lines for people in this room. So there is not one answer for everybody in this room. For some people, the answer is our users don't really use the same data very often. It doesn't matter. The data in memory is the data that they're temporarily working with, and there's a very clear division. For others of you, that's absolutely the wrong answer, and we have to do a whole lot more work. And so the couple of answers is that this is the area of concurrency. It's very hard to do sometimes. And the short answer is that the first one, the temporary storage, what's in the user's memory is like what you're working with in Word and haven't saved yet. And it's a very clear distinction, and it's not a problem. Well, in that case, you just do a concurrency check on save, and you're fine. In other cases, you've got to get a lot more sophisticated than that, and you probably are going to have to do some real-time updating and checking. And that gets more expensive and more difficult, particularly if you're using web services, which might be a better way to describe long pipes.
So is there a one-size-fits-all answer here? I mean, are we just like making work for consultants by trying to do this? Should we all just go back to direct SQL access?
I don't know the answer to that question, but to your previous question, there's like a lot of stuff in Hibernate that really makes a lot of this stuff implicit with like prevalence and stuff like that. Bamboo, and prevalence. I tend to just try to make everything as much explicit as possible. So I often trade off a lot of the automation that my frameworks give me to actually have the designs be a little bit more explicit and a little bit more understandable. I think some of this stuff gets really kind of nasty, the Vietnam scenarios, when you actually start using some of the aspects of some of the more advanced frameworks that are automatic black boxes that no one understands.
When you stop knowing when you're writing to the database.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's not
you have no idea why you're having deadlocks all the time because you didn't know you were writing in the first place.
Or worse, where's the scope of the transaction?
Yeah.
Right?
Where are the... Oh, gee, we started a transaction at 9 o'clock this morning. Hopefully we'll finish tonight. I had an app like that. That
doesn't create deadlocks.
The interesting thing is that particular question isn't really a new one. You had the same kinds of issues all around locks just in the database. What happens if you're busy writing to the database and someone runs the report? How fresh is the report? Do you do read through the locks, etc.? And this type of an issue is one that, I don't know if I see it ever really going away because this is the heart of what our applications do
The risk is, though, I think, with something like D-Link or and I don't know much about Hibernate, but the fact that it almost, I talk to a lot of developers and they don't know when they commit their transactions to the database. They don't know what the scope of the transaction is. And that's a problem today with ADO.NET, and I can only see that getting worse with something like D-Link or an ORM tool. That I just write it to the object, is it saved, or do I have to call that update changes thing? And when I call that update changes thing, what did it actually save? Because I've been messing around with these objects for an hour. So what actually gets saved to the database and persisted is a big problem, and developers need to be aware of what's going on. And if a tool makes it so simple that it hides that fact, then that's a pretty slippery slope. Well, the data set does that for me, so that's great. And D-Link does that for me.
Well, it's actually...
Well, you need a good code generator then that does that for you. And that's another mistake, is that a lot of hand-coded business objects don't do that. They forget about that.
Well, and it's actually one of the complexities to doing... Okay, so the question is, you've got a data set or some other sort of tool of any type that's only using part of the columns. Are you going to save the rest of the columns? Is that the question? Did I get it? Or was it... Okay. So it's actually a very tricky question in concurrency because it's a business question. Whenever we get to a business question, it's hard because we got to explain it to those business people. The business problem here is that I have 3 columns I'm using out of 10. Whether I pull them local or not does not matter. What matters is that the 5th, 6th, and 7th column have been changed by another user. Is it a concurrency conflict or not? Okay? You have to use different techniques. You cannot use just a simple timestamp because if that is not a concurrency conflict, and that 1, 2, 3 fields can be changed by one person, concurrent with 4, 5, 6 fields being changed by another person, and that's a business okay, then you can't just use a timestamp. You got to get more complex than that. And we've done some pretty complex things where we were limited to 64 fields by other reasons, and we've actually set a byte flag coming back from web apps so that we knew exactly which fields the user had accessed, not which ones they'd specifically changed, which is always easy to get, but which ones had been displayed to them so they had the opportunity to change them because we needed to work on exactly this problem. So it can get kind of sticky to solve that. And you know what, I see, and you guys can yell at us about this if you want, but we've just had 2 questions that what we've told you is it's hard.
Well, I would add to this is that in working with that kind of problem in an untyped world is very difficult. Because if I have to go reading gobs and gobs of code, including unit tests, then it's hard. That's hard work. I want a design tool. I want a modeling tool where I get to model my business objects or my entities or what have you, and set rules like this is a read-only field. This should never be changed. That kind of. The database might be nullable, but in my object, I want this to be not null. So I think you need modeling tools, and there's going to be an object model you have to follow for your application.
I couldn't disagree more.
You going to follow that up, or you're just going to
Well,
leave it at
I
that?
mean, I think I appreciate modeling tools. I've spent a lot of money on them, but it's like the scenario that you're talking about is really not something that you can represent in a modeling tool. You know, it's like there's a lot of complexity there, and it's dynamic complexity.
Well, not in our current modeling tools. It's sort of a problem we need to separately model, but not that we could never model.
But I mean, like, we have to solve the problems of today with today's tools, and we start solving today's problems with tomorrow's tools. You know, we start kind of doing a lot of freaky shit.
Well, we have to once
freaky
we understand,
stuff.
Yeah,
freaky stuff.
But
this is not a short pipe, long pipe thing.
But we've got the ability to write new modeling tools that we haven't had before.
I'm sure technology will always move forward, but I just don't see like visual modeling solving a problem like the kind of problem that you're talking about.
Not directly. It may open some doors eventually, but it just lets new people think about it in new ways.
It's like I hear this, I guess that sets me up. I hear like people going, oh yeah, testing is great. I hate testing. I can't wait for DSL. DSL is going to stop me from testing. You know, and this is the kind of thinking. I mean, you got to deal today's problems with today's tools.
Okay.
DSL will not end testing, okay?
There, it's been said. All right, we had one more question here from the back.
Actually, I have more than one question, but they're fast. So first, you're talking about D-Link nonstop, and like, does it really? Can I use it now if I'm shipping an application next month? Could I start using it right now? And would it make me like a lot more productive? And I don't know, like.
It will solve every problem.
Yeah,
on the
that's
face
what
of this earth.
It seems to be what you're saying.
If it ships next year,
piece of cake. So no, actually, D-Link is something that's going to be shipping with Orcus, the next version of Visual Studio.
Okay.
You can download it and you can play with it, but we do not recommend that you use it. For
No go live
So it's not my
license.
solution.
No go live license.
So
And when shall we look for that?
So it's not,
Look for
you
it
guys
when
just
it's
said
there.
this, but I want to clarify. It does not have a go live license, correct?
Does not have a go live license.
in fact, when you start working with it, you get these annoying dialogues that come up and say, "Hey, you know what? You're using C#3. Be careful."
Yeah, okay.
Right.
All the time. Okay, is C# gonna become dynamic one day? No, but because you know it's more oriented towards Scott, because you're the more into object oriented design and object modeling. And I think that's the best way to design an application and to map the business domain to what you want to do in with your application. But have you tried Ruby on Rails? And
I just downloaded Ruby CLR, and I know there's a lot of buzz around it, and I'm trying to temper my nascent strong type fetish with some of the more, some of the things that are coming up from some very smart people.
Okay.
You know? So I don't really know enough about it, and Ted probably knows a hell of a lot more about it than most of us here. But it looks to me like it's something that needs great consideration.
Yeah, because Hibernate and those frameworks, they have a cost and overhead when you're starting to develop, but dynamic languages that have they use active record to access data
Well, active record is typically a one-to-one mapping of objects to data tables, and we get right back to the strongly typed data set generated off a database, and whether or not you actually want to deal that way in memory in an object-oriented environment where you may trade off some of the benefits of OO, and so that's kind of the trade.
And a tool like active record, it's reflecting on that data at runtime. And a data set actually gives you the opportunity to have a different map. You don't have to have it mapped one for one to your database. So there's a good opportunity. But you got to be careful. The dynamic typing doesn't mean untyped. It just means it's dynamically typed. The things do have a type. It's just, the pointers to those types don't have a type.
That's actually one thing to make sure that, I don't know if you've really noticed the link stuff, but on the left-hand side of the x equals something, you're not declaring a type. It is dynamic in nature. That's the whole point of it, is you can query from a lot of different things and you really don't know what the end result is going to be. You have a good idea, but on the left-hand side, you're not saying dim x as customer. You're saying dim x equals. There is no declaration. It is going to figure it out for you.
So also we're going to see more dynamic typing things, I believe in both VB and C#, but only VB. Okay, so VB is going to make a bigger investment in dynamic typing. This is not the same as going back to a VB6 variant. I really want to make sure people get that up front. So when you talk about, a different kind of typing in VB.NET, what are we calling it? Next. VB9. In VB9, we're going to see a different type of typing. It is not a lack of typing, but it looks kind of like what we used to do in VB6. And so it's really important that people understand where we're going with that. And this will allow you to do more Ruby-like things. Ruby's still leading the pack there, and we're not trying to redo Ruby. We're trying to take what makes sense for VB out of that.
And by the way, just a quick, as Scott alluded to, I speak at a conference entitled No Fluff, Just Stuff, where one of the principal advocates of Ruby and Ruby on Rails, Dave Thomas, routinely speaks. And NFJS is coming to Montreal in November, if I remember correctly. If you go to www.nofluffjuststuff.com, you can get all the details. And there's it's a generally Java skewed conference, so you'll have to hide all your .NET shirts when you go. But it is actually, the speakers there, many of them are familiar with .NET technologies, and many of them, none of them, I should say, are zealots in any way, shape, or form. So if you're curious on hearing more about Ruby and Rails and Ajax and some of the bleeding edge stuff, Scott's coming to the NFJS one in Austin.
We've got a bunch of people in a .NET user group in Austin that are like getting a group together to get the bulk rate on tickets, and there's no .NET, nothing at this conference. It's just a great... Just look at the topics. I mean, they're just great topics. And anyway. Ted's there, and Ted's a great topic.
Oh, thank you, Scott. Your check comes later. Any other questions from the audience? Mario, you had your hand up a little while ago. Did you want to jump in on something, or that's a yes?
Well, I just want to come back on the fact that you said it's impossible to have a modeling language or a way to model the situation that Kathleen was describing. And we all agree that we can code this. So if we can code it in C# or VB, this is a model. Yeah. It just, so why could we do that with something that could be visual, or, we can invent any other type of language to express the same capability.
C# is actually quite visual.
So why do you don't like modeling?
Why can't you
Go ahead, Kathleen.
Well, I do just want to clarify, because I made an allusion before, and I know that Mario's kind of thinking on the same lines, and I don't think this is a big secret. Microsoft has released a modeling tool, and that's called DSL. It's a tool that may mean many things over the next few years, but right now, today, what it means is that Mario and I and anybody else who wants to has a new tool to go play with. And what comes out of that, what comes out of having a true modeling and template-based generalized code generator that came out of Microsoft, we don't know yet, but the next 3 years should be really fun and really interesting. And I see no reason that if that is a problem that needs to be solved in a visual way, we won't have a designer in a couple of years, because it's no longer just Microsoft playing that game. And nobody has to write their own designers and visualizers to create that kind of modeling. So it's very exciting. And so when Scott says something like we can't model it, I say, well, I don't know. Give me a year. And basically right now it doesn't have the highest payback, so I'm not going to go work on it. But we may be able to model it in a year.
But so I do want to point out, by the way, that the DSL tools that Kathleen's talking about are what we use ourselves to build the tools in Visual Studio. So the D-Link Designer is built on top of that same framework.
Which, for those of you that don't know, when we say DSL, the long name for that is Domain-Specific Languages, and it is downloadable today, but you may need the full name to find it.
So my feeling about that is that it can be modeled visually. It's just that visual modeling languages have the capital letters are much bigger, and they take up much bigger screen space. So when you try to write something so detailed, like the scenario you were talking about, you tend to end up with a whole hell of a lot of real estate to represent this thing. It's like working in hieroglyphics. So sometimes the detail that you need in a model, and this happened with OCL in UML too. They said, we want to get all this stuff into UML, and it might not be. We might actually Microsoft might knock it out of the park on this one. But if I can go back to the thing that did happen that I guess sets my bias, OCL, they said we want to get enough information into UML so that we can make that stuff executable. So they came up with object constraint language to get all that fine level detail that couldn't be represented in blocks and arrows. And it was frickin' annotated Java inside UML. You know, like,
and that was bad?
Okay.
There comes a
No,
point
it's
where
not
actually
bad.
just
It's
writing the
like,
code is easier.
No, but you're writing source code, but it's not source code. It's just, look, source code is visual. If you couldn't see it, you couldn't do it. It's just a different level of granularity, and you have UML at one level of granularity, and you have source code at another, and if you really wanted to, you can have IL at another, and if you wanted that, you could have like machine language at another, and it's, you know, blah, blah, blah levels of abstraction. I'm just saying that there's certain problems, and there will always be certain problems that have to be represented at the appropriate level of abstraction for the appropriate level of the abstractness of the tools that we have. And I don't know that we're going to get to all that.
Speaking of doing things, there are a number of people out here who are doing the potty dance. So we're going to take a 10-minute break and a word from our sponsors. And when we return, Scott and Kathleen will start flinging chairs at each other. 10 minutes, folks. Come back here. Same bat time, same bat channel.
If there was more beer, now would be the time to bring it up.
The last thing this panel needs, Scott, is more beer. Okay. So let's see. I have a question for you guys. Maybe in particular, Rod and Alan, this is aimed at you guys. You know, a lot of the things that we've been debating about, sort of this intersection of relational and objects and so forth, you know, various contacts and friendships that I've made over the last couple of years, actually spawned from here at DevTeach, have led me to a greater and greater understanding of a language and environment that seems to have done a decent job of integrating relations and objects together in a relatively high-performant way.
What language would that be, Ted?
That would have been FoxPro. What did FoxPro do wrong such that it died such a horrible death? Because we all know that FoxPro is dead.
It's not
dead
quite dead. Who on the panel?
FoxPro is not dead like COBOL. It's dead like Elvis.
Hey, you can find FoxPro at the 7-Eleven?
It's not a FoxPro person.
We're in Canada. Elvis works at the Tim Hortons around the corner. He's there from 4:15 to 4:19 in the morning. Go ahead.
The
Check
problem
it
with
out.
FoxPro was
Believe
that
me.
Bill Gates didn't understand it, and he wrote that gorilla game in BASIC. So that's how it all went.
There's actually a big misperception about Fox. Fox is not dead. VB6 is actually not supported any longer at Microsoft, and Fox actually has a team still kicking out code for the company. So that's a misperception. It's a common one.
The one FoxPro programmer in the audience is happy to hear that. The one FoxPro programmer and one stand-up comic in the audience is happy to hear that.
Actually, Fox did a lot of things right, and there's actually, if you look at what Link and D-Link, where their heritage actually comes from, it comes from a lot of the things that we've been doing in FoxPro since, 1992. We actually had SQL built right into the language. And actually, I don't know if it's in the tech preview yet or not, but we actually had other SQL statements in our language built in, like insert and update, for data, doing actual data manipulation. Actually, there's actually quite a few folks in this room that live in something that I call houses that FoxPro built. That guy right there is one. There's one. Marcus in the back is one. There's a bunch of us. Kathy, I've been to her crib. You should see it. She did real well with FoxPro. Thank you very much.
I did not do FoxPro.
That's okay. You don't have to apologize.
I think I'm the only person up here.
I think you are.
So why did it die? No, you know what I was going to say. I did Power Builder. And Power Builder and FoxPro are very, very similar in that regard.
You're about to get kicked off the stage if you say that.
Well, actually, a couple of interesting stories. The folks who created Power Builder, when they left Colonet, because that's where they came from, they actually had a consulting arm doing Fox Mac programming while they built Power Builder, strangely enough. Anyway, so everything comes around. Why didn't it work? Well, technology does not always win, right? Beta, VHS, etc. There's also a lot of marketing to be done. And, one of the nice things about Fox is that as an untyped language, etc., things like Rails have been common in that community for many years, but no one knew about it. It was a really well-kept secret. And there are a lot of other products that have gone down that path. While I'm kind of ragging on Microsoft a bit, I do also have to say that it's the only product from its time that's still around with a large customer base. Okay, you don't hear about Clipper, Paradox, C English, Power Builder. All of those are essentially gone. So I do, there are some things not done properly, and there are some things done incredibly well. And I'm personally, one of the reasons I pushed to get the VS Data team together with the Fox team was in order to start having this two-way communication between the two, because I think it only makes things better. And the fact that, Anders Halsberg can mention FoxPro in an interview, which is not something that would have happened a few years ago, I think is a good thing, because I think it helps to move the state of the art further in, general programming languages, which Fox never was. It was a database language first and added programming features.
I want to add actually one more thing to what he was saying about the competitors. That's actually why FoxPro sort of, when they bought it in 1992, or and in the subsequent years, it was a decline. It was slower then than it is now. They lost their competitors. Basically, the Ferengi of software, CA bought Clipper, and they wasted that product, which had a
I always
huge
saw
market.
CA as like the place where software goes to die.
Pretty much, yeah. And then Borland, they completely fell on their sword. Actually, DBase for Windows is still around. dbase.com. Some of their end users actually bought the product and are still trying to make a go of it. But Microsoft, when they lose a competitor, they have nothing to do. Just like Internet Explorer. It wasn't until Firefox came around that actually Internet Explorer said, oh, we need to get the band back together because we got this other company to go after. Or I don't even know if it's a company, but whatever it is, it's like, hey, we have something to fight against now, and they didn't. And that's what happens is when the competitors drop off the radar, they move on. That's what happens. And so that's one of the other things that happened to the Fox deal.
So who's the VB and C# competitor?
That would be Java, if I'm not mistaken.
Don't be saying the J word.
I said the J word. I did indeed.
Speaking of saying Java, things, Ruby on Rails, all that. Ruby on Rails is getting much, much, much bigger play now. You know that Ruby on Rails is taken off when Business Week covers a company that built it. As soon as you start reading about a technology in the big magazines, then it's got some mind share, and that'll be a target.
And look at most of the stuff that's coming from Link is inspired from that world.
Well, and I will point out, though, that, having seen this cycle go a couple of times is what led me back on January 1 of this year to predict that the first great Ruby on Rails failure would occur between now and December 31st. But we don't want to make this a Ruby on Rails discussion. We can do that later. We did have a question from the audience, though, and he's been very patiently waiting since before the break.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is a quick one about languages since this session started on FoxPro. What about Iron Python? Because we talk about dynamic typing, and do you see any future for that? And my second question is more from the database side, from the DBA side. Relational database, existed for 15 years or more, and a lot of work has been done, and a lot of problems have been solved. And I'm wondering how this whole world, I'm not against object-oriented, but how do you maintain in real world application, enterprise application? All those problems have been solved, and how do you ensure data integrity? I think the best way is with the relational database. I'm not convinced that any of your solution, makes it in the. I think the object world hasn't made a consensus. After 10 years, you have frameworks, you have, and they seem good to do simple things. But when it comes to real world, I'm not convinced that object world.
You mean kind of like the .NET base class library?
Java or .NET, the object world.
Well, we still store the data in relational databases, so maybe that says something to what you're saying.
You just said we don't need any database anymore, and persistence
no, Ted
is an
did that.
in-store database.
Ted just said that. I don't think anybody
costs
here believes
nothing.
that.
No, I do believe that. No, I do believe that for certain applications that you don't need a database. When you're building applications that are transaction processing databases, for some extent, you need to get access to things that happened in the past. Whether you get that stuff in the past from a relational database or an object database or from the registry, if you're that suicidal, whatever you have. I mean, the fact is that at some point in a transaction or some business process, you need to get something that happened in the past and you pull that out as in a representation. If that representation is an object, or if it's a data set, or if it's a data reader, that's something. So I worked for a company that had, we needed really high performance data. I mean, non-trivial like Google speed of data. Google is not stored in SQL Server. Google is stored in memory on a grid. When you get up to that level, the database, a relational database, isn't really sufficient anymore.
But I don't think any of us mean to say we're talking about it because it is important that we not think data store equals SQL Server, because that is not a valid thing to say. However, for 90% of our applications, or some number that's relatively high, you're absolutely correct. We can't beat a relational database today. And so there's many, many, many applications where relational database is the back end is absolutely the right thing. And the registry is obviously a complete joke. Hopefully that translated. But some of the things like the in-memory stuff is not a joke. There are applications where we do want to think more broadly than a relational database. But you're right. They're good.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that's happening with SQL Server is it's becoming a full-fledged application server. You can host web services in it now.
Wait, that's a good thing.
Is that
a good thing?
Well, it's got a queuing mechanism. Well, the thing is that, what did MTS buy us, right? Declarative automatic transactions. That's the only thing people really use it for. I mean, who cares?
That's all it was intended to do in the first place, so that's a good thing.
Yeah. But I mean, I could use transaction scope, probably more intentionally than I can use COM+ automatic transactions, and I can read the code and I can understand what the scope of my transaction is. I can't do that with COM+. So although it's automatic, I still don't understand what my transaction is.
Yeah, Yuval would probably disagree that you can't read that, but it is there to be read if you choose to. It perhaps may be a question of how easily it's understood.
I can follow the linear progression of a transaction using transaction scope, where it's relatively obvious where the transaction begins and where it ends.
I wanted to just mention something. Barry, you were saying, look at SQL Server turning into an application server. Also, in addition to what we're getting with link and d-link and all of that inside of .NET, ADO.NET 2 also has been given unbelievable power where if you know what you're doing and have the right resources and don't shoot yourself in the foot, you can cache data sets with millions of rows in them, and it can handle that and handle it beautifully.
I'm seriously waiting for the moment that Scott Guthrie decides to host SQL Server in process, or SQL Server starts serving up ASP pages.
Well, this is the interesting question, Barry, because you made the analogy just a second ago that SQL Server is turning into the application server, and yet over there on the other half of the world, the world that Scott pays a lot of attention to and that I, spend half my life in, we're actually making a very, very strong movement away from the application server and doing things more in proc, right? Which then leads to the interesting question of, is SQL Server going down that wonderful path that EJB went down? And is that a good thing? Do we want application servers?
There was almost an allusion to this gentleman's question as well, was talking about, in a lot of ways, relational databases haven't changed since the first implementations from IBM and ultimately Oracle and so forth. Fundamentally, we used to talk about the acid test all the time. It was a big deal. This was with the reliability of a database. We don't talk about it anymore because it's presumed.
Well, now acid test means you pee into a cup.
There's that too. But the product sort of held still. We haven't really done much. I mean, one of the biggest reasons I can see Microsoft adding all that capability to SQL servers, they had to ship a new version. And you have to put something in there. And let's face it, the transactions work. You really can't do it any better than we're already doing it. So what are you going to sell?
Probably the best thing that happened to the CLR is that the SQL team decided to host it.
Absolutely. The CLR got a huge shakeout by being hosted in SQL Server.
I would say
wait. Rod's giving the thumbs down on that one.
Well, Now, Rod, two different issues here. There's a reason the CLR is off by default in SQL Server, but I'm saying in terms of the quality of the framework itself was improved by the exercise of putting it into SQL Server.
That's
Doesn't
exactly
actually make it a good idea, but
the framework in the runtime got a huge overhaul because
huge.
They needed it to run in a stateful, always up environment, and it couldn't do that in 1.0.
Why is it such a bad idea to do the CLR? I mean, why did they put it there if it's such a bad idea to use it there?
That's an excellent question.
Well, I'm glad I asked it then.
I actually blogged about this quite a while back. There are certain aspects of it that are interesting, but the concept of writing triggers and stored procedures to me is a flawed idea completely, because it completely moves the problem that we have been trying to solve for the last 10 years, is that business logic should go in a middle tier object. SQL does not scale out very well, in my opinion.
Time to disagree.
Yeah, I disagree totally.
So just because you can write a virus in C++ doesn't mean we shouldn't ship a C++ compiler. Just because you can misuse SQL CLR and put all your business rules in SQL Server doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. We have customers who have gained 2,000 times better performance over what they had in some stored procs that use T-SQL. And the reason was that they were using T-SQL for the wrong reasons, but they had no choice because it was the only language available to them inside of SQL Server.
Yeah, I would like to sort of clarify that I agree that there should be separation between persistence code and business logic. Logical separation. I don't think there needs to be physical separation.
SQL does not scale out well.
Define what you mean by that, Rod. What do you mean
Scaling
scale
out
out?
means I can't have one single store of my data and 14 SQL servers pounding against that. It's a one-to-one relationship. It's one big box against one big set of data. I can't do it. There is no way to do it. It doesn't grid. It doesn't do what you call active clustering where I can do that. It just doesn't. Otherwise, we would be doing it. So what you do is you scale up. You buy bigger and bigger and bigger boxes.
Well, boxes have gotten bigger, so we can go a lot further.
Exactly, they do, and it doesn't scale out. And I think I know a little bit about Oracle, not a ton, but their scaling out solution I think is better from the things that I understand about it, is that you can have multiple Oracle servers pounding against the same data store. Yes, I agree. There are certain things. I do agree with what Alan says. There are certain functions that you shouldn't be writing complex financial transactional type of instructions in T-SQL. It's not geared for it. And yes, there are places. The thing of it is that we as consultants are going to make a boatload of dough unwiring all these business rules that people put in their database.
But look how nicely they wrote them in C# so we can move them easily now.
Oh, definitely. No doubt. I mean, there are merits to it. I like the ability to create my own custom data type, which kind of moves us a little bit into the whole object in the database type of thing. And actually the performance of that's pretty good. I also like the aggregation, the ability to create my own custom aggregates. So I'm not saying it's 100% without merit. And yes, I know, we put out C++ and people can write viruses and people can do bad things, right? Guns don't kill people, people kill people. That's just the way it goes. So that's what, I'm in Canada. Yes, we have guns in America, okay? Sorry, I threw that in there,
Yeah, those haven't been in Canada for at least 100 years.
There are a lot of guns in Canada. We just like to aim them at other things than people.
Oh. I never thought about that.
So Rod, you mentioned making CLR-based data types. So are you happy with the versioning strategy on that?
I have not actually implemented one. It's got some issues from my experimentation with it, yes. There are problems with it right now.
So if you're going to use that feature, then you need to think about your versioning up front. Maybe Alan wants to talk about that.
No,
but if you ignore that problem, you can be shooting yourself with a fairly large caliber weapon in the foot.
But, let's keep it in perspective. It's not an object-oriented database technique. You can't store objects in the database using UDTs. It's meant for scalar simple types. And how often does the structure of a varchar or a temperature or a linear measurement change? These are very simple types. And
sure, but that's not what you're seeing at Tech Ed. There's an issue about guidance here, about like once Microsoft marketing gets a hold of a cool feature, they go, hey, look at this. With this large-scale weapon, you can blow both your feet off with one shot.
And that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, sure. You know,
means less
and
money
that's
spent
not everybody
on
at
bullets.
Microsoft, not to be a generalist, but there are guidance in this. And when you guys in Redmond have to understand what it's like with dealing with guys in the field, some of these guys are on a lot of serious drugs. And we get guidance that's like, no, please don't, please, like, I'm already too busy. Don't give me that to sort of undo, and you can, and they are powerful tools. But, Microsoft is in this interesting place where it's this incredible power of this enforce for developer guidance. MSDN is an extraordinary power in the industry. And at the same time, it's governed by a company that's selling tools. So you got this guidance practice, and then you got this developer guidance, and you got the tools that go along with it. And somewhere in there's marketing people going, all I want to do is buy another boat. It's really ugly, really quick.
Scott, seriously, don't hold back. Tell us what you really think.
Can you make sure I get a copy of that last piece on tape for later? Thanks. Taping this, so I totally need to have that.
What happens in Montreal stays in Montreal.
No way, man.
That's always been my policy.
That's going to be on endless loop in my office.
DevTeach's slogan next year: "What happens at DevTeach stays at DevTeach."
That's right.
So wait a minute. I feel like you guys are kind of talking out of both sides of your mouth here for a second, because in the first half of the session, we were talking about databases that were sort of at the center of these enterprise systems, and they have lots of different applications accessing this code. And I think it was Barry said, I don't want my business code living in C# because then it's only accessible by a single application. But then we turn around and say we don't want business logic inside the database because it's hard to maintain there. And it would seem like if I can get the union of C#, a language which presumably is good to express business logic in, don't talk yet, Barry, I'm not done yet. Right? We got this language and we can put it inside close to the data. Scott, stop. Wouldn't this necessarily be a good thing? I mean, why wouldn't I want that business logic close to the data?
Well, the point is you can reuse that business logic from Java if you put it in the database in C#.
But you guys are saying it's bad.
I didn't say it's bad. I think it's appropriate when moving that logic.
Those guys are saying it's bad. Argue with them.
What do they know?
It just needs a lot. It needs.
No, I'll clarify.
It needs a lot better guidance.
Jerry.
Rod's point's valid about the scalability, but sometimes putting certain business logic closer to the data because it's related to the data is important. If I have to withdraw out, 10,000 records of data out of the database to generate one number, which is, an underwriter's number that they're looking, that doesn't make any sense. Put it in the database and you're not pumping all that data out. And then you can call it from Java too, if you'd like.
There you go.
Well, one thing that I think it's important to keep in this conversation as you look at where to put your business logic is that if we can isolate business logic, which in today's world is a very large if, but if we can isolate it, it is the most valuable thing you do because it defines your business, and I realize some of you may not have thought about this before, but nothing else does. Very few businesses know what they're doing except through the code that's doing it, which should be terrifying to you. However, you cannot underestimate the power of your business parts of your code, except that it's right in the middle of your UI code or your database code or something else right now. And so it's one of the reasons we want to try to isolate it. And if putting it in the database makes it more isolated, I think that there's some value to that. However, overall, the concerns Rod has are real. You can only go so far with that server.
Well,
and as you scale up, what are you going to do?
Here's an interesting question, Kathleen. What is it that companies are routinely more scared about losing, the data or the code?
They're more scared about the data because they don't understand. Most managers do not understand the value of the code they were holding and why it's valuable. And this is why the Y2K problem was scary, because we couldn't get in and understand the business in order to rewrite it. And that's why we didn't toss all those applications, is because we couldn't. We didn't know what they did.
I just wanted to say I have a client who is more scared of losing his code than his data. Not his code, but his business, his IP, his business IP. He's, we secure all the data because we do a lot of stuff across the pipe, across the web. Everything's totally secure, but when it comes down to brass tacks, he's more concerned about his IP than anybody seeing his data or mucking with his data.
See, now this is interesting to me because most of the times when you know, I talk with clients, when I talk with other consultants, the general perception seems to be the reverse. This notion that they're more concerned about losing their data, which is why their database is routinely backed up every which way from Sunday, and their source code repository is not. So is that just saying that, you know, everybody outside the 6 people sitting on that stage is stupid? Or are we talking are we using different terms?
Yeah. And we're starting a new company, the 6 of us, and we just want you to know that we represent the best in the industry.
It's called we're not stupid.com.
Well, the thing is that if managers actually, if the business people, the ones that are investing, actually understood how little we know our organizations, even complex organizations, they would freak out. And in fact, that's actually an issue within the SEC. If you look at what they're doing, when they come back and they say something like, companies now have to tell us what they think their environmental liabilities are. Now think about that. That means before the SEC says that, nobody either knew or admitted what their environmental liabilities were, and you've got companies, at least in the U.S., that will go under because of their environmental liabilities. And so you're saying that we really do not understand our companies on a very big basis, and we break it up in our code. So you're only doing one small aspect of the company in that mission-critical application, but that is still where the information about how they do that job is, because it was gathered from a bunch of users over a bunch of period of time, and it was coalesced into your code, probably, or at least possibly into documentation, but somebody lost the documentation a long time ago.
I do want to disagree with one assumption, which is that the business people and the IT shops don't care about it. One of the reasons why everyone keeps talking about N-tier and separate out into business objects and separate out into business rules is to get it, strangely enough, separated out so that it can be modified easily, so that it can be worked with. So I think, you know, we're looking at 2 different dimensions of the problem. The reason you back up the database so much is because your database is something that in today's technology is changing on a second-by-second basis. Your application that you put into production, if you're saying that that's the storage for the rules, and I agree there should be a better place for it, that's not something that's changing from second to second.
Okay, I agree with you, except for the fact that when we nicely say we're separating our business logic, we have a business object. The vast majority of business objects contain a great percentage, maybe 90 to 100% in some cases, of plumbing code. That is not business logic.
So I agree with you. I said at the beginning that I didn't think we came far enough along, but the reason that we're all moving into that is because there is a fundamental understanding that we do need to get that stuff separated out.
Okay, and to add one more thing, we actually have a tool now to do that, okay? There's a tool to separate that out that you didn't have a year ago. Anybody want to guess what it is? It's a test. Did you come to my talk?
Notepad?
Nobody came to my talk that's here? Oh, what did you say?
Notepad.
What did you say?
Notepad.
See, she pays a lot of attention.
Partial classes. Why can't you put your business logic adjacent to all that plumbing crap in your partial class?
But why not just separate it in terms of layers instead of partial classing?
Well, because as of today, our layers are fundamentally required to do plumbing. We can't build it without it.
I would take an IT spin on your comment about they always want me to back up the data. And the past couple of years, I've been dealing with companies that have had catastrophic failures, like wiped out, physically had the building removed by a hurricane.
This was your deal down in the Cayman Islands,
Yes.
right? By Hurricane Ivan,
Yes.
was it? Yes.
So
I
we
remember.
backed up the data, and they were really excited about the fact that we had the data backed up. And we got the database back up and running in Miami in a week, and no code. And we told them the database is back, and they were kind of surprised that nobody was doing any work. You know, the problem is that the mortals, when they say back up the data, they actually meant the whole thing. They don't get that there's different parts involved in this. We happen to take it out as the data because, hey, there's a backup tool for data. That's pretty easy to back up, so I'll do that. But, yeah, the actual experience of dealing with people getting from a scratch recovery like that is Yeah, they wanted all of the code.
There's
they wanted the whole
a
thing.
Team Foundation joke in here somewhere. I just can't find it.
Actually, the interesting deal is that what Kathleen was talking about is Sarbanes-Oxley. It has a big part of that now is disaster recovery and what your plans are. So I know a lot of my companies that I work with, they deal in the banking world, FDIC regulations, and they have plans, and the code is included, and they have failovers of the whole thing. They shut one end down, they turn the other end on, and it should all work, including app code. So by regulation, that is a requirement.
I used to work for a guy, a gentleman by the name of Mike Cohn. Kathleen, you may know him because he lives in the Denver area. And Mike actually, shortly after I started working for him, we walked into the production room one day, and he walked over to the development database server, and he literally walked over to the power switch and ka-chunk and flipped it off just to be able to see how long it would take developers, the IT staff supporting the development servers and so forth, how long it would take them to notice that this stuff was down and exercise whatever recovery procedures were there, which is to say there weren't any at the time. And it was literally 5 hours before anybody thought to check if the machine was on. And so one of the things that I would definitely suggest to anybody in the room is that if you have recovery procedures that you've never tested, you don't have recovery procedures. One other question, and Scott, this is something I want you to sort of address. I know that a friend of mine, Neil Ford, who was at the Microsoft Competitive Technology Summit, looked at Link, and one of the things that he and his company, ThoughtWorks, are very, very big on is testing. How do we mock out and test these various data approaches, right? Scott, obviously you're coming from the test-driven development, but all of you have said that testing is important. So how do we automatically test, each of the individual approaches? How do I unit test a database? How do I unit test my domain objects that are OR mapped? How do I, do I even bother unit testing code gen? What do I test when I do, untyped stuff? Talk to me a little bit about the testing angle, because you get, not just it's good, but how do I do it?
I'll go first with a shot on this one.
Good, because I really have to go to the bathroom.
The TDD guy walks out the door.
You had your chance. You went for more beer.
Where's the pair? Come on, bring the other guy up. Oh, he's just coming up because we're offering beer to people in the chair.
That's right. Scott's going to pass up on his beer.
Actually, the way that we do it is in the applications that we build database-wise, it's all about stored procedures, and that's actually a beautiful API because that's what it's all about. It's all about the API. That's what TDD is focused on, is testing objects and calling the methods and setting the properties. Luckily, all we have is methods with variables that we hand into them, and it's really easy to actually build automated tools for calling stored procedures and then testing the results that come back. It is an API. We don't do any munging of code in the middle tier to go query anything. So we have a consistent API to test against.
Do you advocate TDD from a stored proc perspective?
Definitely.
Okay.
There's so many things I want to say on this, and so I'm going to try to keep this pretty short. First of all, I think an awful lot of people actually don't do test-driven development, but they do test-during development, which is kind of it's a little shift that takes out a whole lot of the work. So if you're already doing test-during development, I don't think you should feel guilty about it. What that is basically before you check in. Instead of trying to mock objects and some of the stuff up front, you can get away with that. The answer is you absolutely need to test your code generation because it's part of your overall application, and there's a lot of testing you should do there. Another aspect of it, which I've done some work on, and I haven't had a whole lot of energy on, but I'd love to start a workspace on, is doing generated tests. Because there's a huge number of tests, largely tests that we are not doing today, such as test against everything that could be null being null, all those things against your database that we're generally not doing. There's a whole lot of testing we should be doing that we can automate, and we can automate that through some declarative stuff. I call it declarative testing. So that's an area that we can move forward in. And finally, there's something else I think that now that Scott's back, I'd love to hear him respond to this.
We can stop stalling, right? That's what you're saying.
No, I wasn't stalling. It's something called test-driven maintenance, which is a way to say that if you find a bug after the code leaves your desk, okay, so after you check it in, if you find a code, it represents two bugs. It represents a bug within your application that needs to be fixed, and it represents a bug within your testing as to how it got out the door. And so if you address both of those bugs, then what you'll do is over time you will increase the amount of testing that you're hitting against the areas that you are having the most problems with. And so it's a way, I don't think it replaces testing during development, but it does add to your test plan over time. And just one last thing, just because I realize we have people here from a wide variety of experiences with testing. If you think about it, what do you need to test more? Your side case or your main track? Somebody is going to catch the main track before it goes out the door. They will not catch the side case. So test your side cases. That was a whole lot of stuff really fast because I had a whole lot to say.
Scott? Or are you still recovering from your bathroom experience? Scott's still recovering. Barry?
I agree with everything they said. Just one other thing I'll mention is that there's a development practice, and I think probably still a lot of people are doing it, but I think we need to get away from is developers developing, writing, and testing their applications connected to a central development database server. And I think we need to move to a process. I mean, we don't do that with IIS. We install IIS locally, most reasonable places, and we test the application locally on our own machine. We need to start doing the same thing with the database. We need to have our own local copy of the database because you know what? If you start writing stuff in C# triggers or user-defined types and you change that on the server, then you're messing up everybody else. So it's just a practice we need to get into, and Microsoft does a really crappy job of giving us tooling to do that.
Yeah.
Can I get an amen?
Yeah. You know, part of the reason that we steer clear of putting separate databases on each of the developer sites is that they do make changes to it, and it's bloody hard to take 5, 10 different databases and roll those changes up into one place.
What was the original question, Ted?
The original question was how do you test the various layers? But we got into some really good testing discussion anyway. Do you want to jump on that real quick before
I want to throw out Michael Feather's stuff. That a unit test is not a unit test if it talks to the database, if it touches any network resources, be it SOAP or remoting, if it hits the file system, if it requires configuration changes, or requires some sequence. So while you guys are thinking a lot about unit testing, understand that there's this other process in this world of J that understands from having dealt with these problems that came up with J2EE in that world of J, that they've kind of a couple of years ahead of these problems, and they've solved them. And they said, this is really difficult crap to test. So let's try to create isolation. And they have real serious practices around this, and that involves stuff like Spring, maybe not Spring. Spring might not be the solution, but dependency inversion, and there's a great interview with Ted about why this exists on .NET Rocks, actually, from going back a long time ago, with Don Box and Mike, Mark. Oh crap, I forgot. Anyway.
Yeah, Mark, and I just lost his last name.
Yeah, bleep that. Sorry. And there are practices around this to do this. You don't need to have a database online to test business logic that talks to a database. You can plug in a simulator. That's what test-driven development is trying to do. Test-driven development is not trying to be a QA practice. Test-driven development is trying to drive your design from the perspective of validation so that you hit these walls that you can't get through until you introduce interface-based development, plug-in architectures that are automated by a DI tool like Object Builder from Patterns and Practices, and then you introduce into that simulator objects so that you can get away with doing these things without actually having real data online. So if you've got a database on your development box, I don't give a damn, because I really don't test that stuff until cruise control picks it up and runs against my integration build.
And I will support Scott in this one sense that there is just this once, because I don't want to make a habit of this. There is a couple of guys who've been doing a lot of the database refactoring stuff. Have just recently released a book entitled "Refactoring Databases." Scott Ambler, Scott mentioned his name earlier. He spent a significant amount of time talking about this stuff. And one of the things that has to be understood is that the J crowd built a number of the tools that were alluded to that we don't have in the Microsoft space. They built a number of those tools to try to make some of those refactorings easier, right? Not saying they're easy, but to make them easier. And there's a book by a gentleman by the name of Mike Clark called Pragmatic Project Automation, and there is a .NET version of that book that will be coming out soon as the author can get off his duff and write it. Don't point at me. Just because I'm the author doesn't mean I want to plug my own book. Kathleen, you wanted to say something.
Yeah. I think Scott, I want to challenge some of what you said, okay? And I want to be, for just a second, an ordinary developer trying to get something out the door. And I can hear you and I can understand, all this great test-driven development stuff, and I'll even actually believe you. But the hurdle to get there is bigger than I can handle. And in the meantime, I can set up real-world tests. I don't know what I want to call them because you don't want to call them unit tests, and they test against my database, and they run in cruise control, and I can very deeply improve my process without going into some of these very theoretical things that I just don't get yet.
Right.
And so I want to make that hurdle jump. And in my opinion, it's most important that I put the testing in, work towards a scenario where I have a cruise control of some sort, even if it's me pushing a button, that I'm regularly testing every day, maybe every hour, and that's really the purpose of cruise control. That stuff has a payback. I'm seeing that payback real quick. It's harder to see the payback of testing a business rule without a database behind it.
Well, it takes 10 times longer to execute the business rule test when there's a database involved, and there's also issues in maintaining the test data. So the TDD, or the Agile value proposition, says essentially that your productivity will be like out of this world compared to what RAD will give you. If you take a moment to measure your productivity over the life of several iterations, rather than that first moment in time where code is created. So we have this software creationalist movement going on where we're entirely focused on something that Barry said earlier. I'd rather write less code. Why? What is it about that writing less numbers of code?
You haven't seen my code.
Okay, there's that. But that's, okay, so it goes back to design.
It's us that doesn't want Barry to write code,
Okay.
not Barry himself.
So your cruise control code is not going against the database, or it is going against the database?
Some of it is, some of it isn't.
Okay, so those later iterations are primarily relying on my cruise control code, correct? Or are they relying on something else?
The later iterations?
Later iterations.
No. I mean, we have it's all happening all at once.
Okay, so I guess what I'm saying is...
So the in-IDE experience for the developer testing has no database engaged. We use simulators.
Mm-hmm.
The cruise control automated build and test engages the database, but only after it's also run all the developer tests that are in IDE tests. So we have multiple layers of validation that each test a certain aspect, or teach, not an aspect, and it's not even a concern. It's an extent of depth of the system.
Okay, well, let me just ask this as simply as possible as a developer. Okay, so I'm just playing that role for a second. I know I have to write the test that includes the database. I have to do that before I release. Quality control, sanity of developers, I want to do that as early as possible, because if I do that as early as possible, I get the greatest payback from it. It's good business sense. I get that. So what do I gain in addition to that when I write another set of tests that to some degree duplicates the test that I'm running with a database hooked up?
Because they don't duplicate it.
Okay.
Because you get one level set of tests that's basically testing your business logic, and if it hits a data access layer, that's got to go out and get some data back before it can make a decision and an if and else statement about what branch to take to execute other business logic. Then you can basically test those branches by saying, well, I'm going to plug in a simulation for the database that automatically returns this number or that number in this and that test scenario, right? So that's going to be extremely fast. So developers are going to be more encouraged to run that test constantly.
Hey, Scott, you want some help? Because Sam here is like
Sammy's
about
just
ready to
chomping
beat me
at
over
the
the
bit.
head for the mic. Go for it, Sam.
Go for it.
I'm just chomping at the bit to join in now because you got on my favorite subject here, like Scott, which is Agile. And one of the things I wanted to respond to that you said, Kathleen, about the difficulty for average developers, I hear that hourly, daily, in the attacks that the Microsoft community makes on us Agile bloggers, because if it's not guided through a wizard, they just don't even try to understand it. But I hear that all the time, and I just can't understand that. I have a team of 8. 4 of us were, Agile experts. 4 of the people on the team had never seen a unit test in their life. They're all 21 years old, out of school, and within 1 to 2 days, they were writing unit tests. The end unit tests we're talking about range from 3 to 5, 6 lines. And the other thing I want to respond to about the duplication, one of the principles we have is dry, don't repeat yourself. So we never have duplicated tests or duplicated code. When we see that, we recognize that as a code smell, we refactor and remove it. The problem is that nothing in the Microsoft space, none of the tools, none of the guidance tells how to work in this way. And when we came up with extreme programming in the late 90s, the Smalltalk world had been doing this, the Java world did it after. It's really the Microsoft world that is way behind in modern software development processes, because tools lead you in a direction, you follow that direction religiously, and it doesn't empower you to think outside the tool.
So I guess I just want to respond in this way. What I really wanted to do is I don't think we should maybe stay on testing just a whole lot longer, but everybody in this room has the capacity to go back and start writing unit tests tomorrow and to run them on a regular basis. This is not a difficult thing to attack. It becomes a scary thing to attack when you decide that you also have to get deep into the theory of test-driven development. And what I want to make sure that I put on the table here is that, okay, maybe that stuff has value. I haven't seen it yet with my stuff. So what I have seen the value of, and I can just very strongly encourage you to do, is put the testing that you need, which is primarily side case testing. It is primarily something that these gentlemen would probably call a functional test because of the definition that Scott just gave that limited a unit test very strongly to a little thing. It's still run with the same unit testing tools. Put that stuff in place and start running it on a daily or an hourly basis. That will change your development world, and the payback will be immediate. Now, is there a value in going as far as these guys go? I'm not going to say there's not, but I'm going to say that many people in this room cannot go back and do that tomorrow. You can go back tomorrow and put something in place that may be as simple as an MS build or as simple as a very small unit test change of simply using the team test tools or NUnit to get those tests in place and run them regularly.
I would say that those types of functional tests are very difficult to do as part of a build because in anything other than a simple application, if you're testing a class library, that's fine, but if you're using COM+ and a database and web services and remoting, you can't run those types of tests until you deploy. And to make that part of a deployment fall into a continuous integration is even more work. Whereas the unit tests are actually very easy.
So how many of you finish your code, check it in, and haven't run it against the database yet? You've already got the database running because you didn't get far enough before you did that. That's the way we really develop is against working databases.
You know, Sam, you sit here, you hear these people talk theoretically about like Agile, and it's like it just doesn't go anywhere.
Well, actually, one thing.
Look, guys, let me just lay out how my shop works. And I got an experience like Sam. We took 20-year-old veterans C guys who never did OO and turned them into senior .NET architects in the space of 3 weeks. That's pair programming. That's what that's for. Level the playing field of skills. We couple that with tests first. When you think of tests first, you start to think about your design in perspective of what is this supposed to do before I start crunching out code. Once you do that, you hit walls. You hit interface-based development. You build interfaces, you build plugins, you use a framework to automate the plugins because we don't have anything like that aside from what Rob Howard did in the provider model. You go from there to testing the database. Test CRUD in the database because the interface is already enforce the contract between business logic and database, so you only test the CRUD. You push that into fitness where the programmers basically take a step back and the customers write tests in a domain-specific language. We push all that shit up in a cruise, and yes, I've got NAND tasks that deploy servers.
You know what? I totally agree.
And it's end-to-end automation
I totally
like
agree
you
with
couldn't
you.
even imagine because Microsoft MSDN is just not telling you that you can go this far.
I totally agree with you. I just wanted to make the point to Kathleen or anybody else is that it's actually easier to do the unit tests first and then proper unit tests as opposed to these functional tests. They take more work.
Yeah, they're slower. They've got a lot of more complexity.
They're tougher to debug because there's several different things that could be wrong.
Integration tests, if you look at test code and integration test suite, the methods themselves actually tend to be longer, bigger. So we want to do less of those things.
Actually,
so we want to get more of that shit into the class library and simulate more of it so that we can only do this external big fat testing stuff as much as we have to do.
Welcome to our testing panel.
Just do it.
And this goes back to data access by saying, if you build this crap in objects first, you can test it all and then just do your data access as CRUD, except where you can't. And it turns out that the portion of the place where you need to do business logic is basically optimizations, and really try to minimize everything that you can't prove. I don't care if it's TDD or C# or VB. If you can't prove what you're about to put into live production, whether it's TDD or waterfall, if you can prove it, do it. If you can't, back off.
She believes you.
Oh, I don't know if I believe him or not.
The deal is, well, actually, here's the level that she believes you. And this goes back to my very first college advisor. He said, remember the concept, not the technology. It's the concept that's important. And that's the whole thing where this religion debate starts to get in there. The concept is we should test. You know what? It really helps if we test in an automated way. And there are ways and flavors of doing this test. And you're right, and you're right, Sam's right. And hopefully you're all testing. So hopefully you're doing some kind of automated testing now. It's the concept that's important.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you get scalability by tacking on scalability? And do you get security by tacking on security? And do you get all those things afterwards?
Scott, it's done, man.
Is it?
It's done.
All right.
It's done.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a hand to our panelists. And remember, as you go forward, if anybody disagrees with anything that was said on this panel, they're just wrong. Good night.
Studio Talk Show.